Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where we cultivate change from the inside out as we ponder the Cairo question. Will Cairo have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? We stand on the belief that dismantling racism goes beyond laws and legislation or politics and economics. Here, anti-racism activation is presented as an inside job where personal transformation and accountability impact social change. So take a seat at the anti-racism activation table with Inflection Point Podcast.
Well, hello there, and thank you for joining us for yet another episode of Inflection Point Podcast, where we are dedicated to the art of listening and authentic conversation. We challenge our audience to listen actively and intentionally for the purpose of self-awareness, understanding, personal transformation, and ultimately social impact. I am your host, Anita Russell, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce co-hosts Mavis and Gail.
Hello, I'm Mavis Bauman. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, I'm Gail Hunter, and welcome.
Excellent, excellent. So we have a really great topic this evening. And as you know, if you've been watching us for a while, you know that we've been doing this Sankofa Generational Leadership Continuum series. And we are continuing that with this episode and one more episode this year. And just for your benefit, the Sankofa Leadership Continuum is defined as a through line running from historical leaders of the past to contemporary leaders of the present, to those who will emerge as future leaders in the future. Melding together historical and contemporary reality, this through line inspires resistance, activism, art, literature, ethnography, and research to fuel transformation. So today, our topic is films that spark community conversation. So we want to actually start off with a community conversation. I'm going to have Mavis give us a little bit more of the background. So I'll just give you a little bit of on the front end. So this community conversation came about as a result of watching the film Who We Are, a Chronicle of Racism in America. It was hosted by the Presbyterian Church of Sudbury, Massachusetts. And the Who We Are project was founded by Jeffery Robinson, renowned lawyer who has been fighting for racial justice for almost 40 years. The organization is an outgrowth of a talk that Robinson has been giving for the past 10 years on the history of anti-Black racism and white supremacy in the United States. So this talk forms the basis of the feature-length film, The Who We Are. And the project is one of the central voices that will correct the narrative on our shared history of anti-Black racism in the United States. So I'm going to pass the baton at this point over to Mavis, and she's going to tell us a little bit about how did that come to fruition, and then we'll talk about what the outcome was.
Great. Through the time of COVID, I got connected with a church in Sudbury, Massachusetts. I live in New Jersey, but I started attending this church via Zoom. And this particular church has an amazing pastor, Black woman. Her name is Desiree Lawson. And I became connected with her through the work that I'm doing, with my podcast folks and in other areas on the subject of racism. So we formed a little team in the church and came up with the idea to share this movie and watch it together as a church. We did that in May, I think, and it was sparsely attended. But there were a couple of people there from other churches who said, let's do this again. So we did, and we just did it this last weekend. We had over 50 participants. We had sponsors from 7 different organizations. And y'all, it was great. We broke out into discussion groups. We talked about where we were in terms of our own engagement with becoming anti-racist, being aware of racial issues. That was fascinating. And it really went well. We were from such different backgrounds, but most of the folks online were from the Sudbury area in Massachusetts, which is very white. So it was encouraging to have all of these people come both on site and into Zoom and participate. One thing that tickled me today was one of the ladies that was a member of a co-sponsoring organization sent a very nice note to the leader of my team. And she said, she talked about being so glad to meet all of us. She says, it was evident to me that the collaboration among faith communities was successful. This is something for all of us to be proud of and to plan to do more of. The key organizers at PCIS were committed, organized, and effective. The program went off without a hitch. We at Bethel look forward to continued collaboration with all of you on social justice initiatives. We have your emails and we'll be reaching out to you as time goes on. And we hope you will reach out to us at Bethel as we work in parallel to repair the world. That's a pretty strong statement. I was just very excited about that because it's like this movie sparked a conversation that is now catching fire. I mean, the movie the documentary really is so incredible that it doesn't surprise me, but that sort of feedback with people that we had never worked before was really encouraging. And my feeling is post viewing that everyone in the room is going to tell somebody else about to watch that film. And it's just such a great piece on racial and the racial history of America. So that's my bit. Anything I left out, Anita?
No, that was fine. So that was a great lead in to how this came to be. So what I'd like to do now is dig into what you and I experienced, because when we did it, the session the other day, this community conversation, you and I served as facilitators in the online virtual room. So there were rooms where people were present physically, as Mavis had mentioned, in a particular church. And when we did the breakout sessions, they kind of went into a different room in the church, but we online had multiple breakout rooms, and Mavis and I had the opportunity to actually serve as a facilitator, not together, but in 2 different groups, participants that were there. So I have to say that I wasn't absolutely sure how it was going to go. I mean, I had some slight reservations and things like that. However, I was pleasantly surprised. And I was pleasantly surprised by the fact that the folks who were watching were very engaged with what they were seeing. So it wasn't a situation where there were some people that kind of saw this from an entertainment perspective. So we're sitting here and watching this documentary film and all of that. It wasn't entertainment for anybody.
Yeah.
And the impact of being able to be in the conversation was the amazing part of the whole thing. So what we did was we watched the first half, and then we took a break and went into the breakout rooms to have these group discussions occurring simultaneously. And then we reconvened and watched the second half, broke out again into the same groups and continued the conversation. And then came back together and just had some wind down time with people kind of sharing what the experience was like for them. And I was the only Black person that was present. And not that that concerns me or anything like that, but I'm just saying that just to kind of set the tone so people can kind of get the context of the environment that we were in and everything. Like I said, I was very pleasantly surprised because if you've been listening to me talk, you know the idea of conversations, having those grassroots level, in your face, eye to eye conversations, I think is one of the things that is so incredibly necessary. When you think about Inflection Point podcast, and we built it on courage, because first of all, you got to have the courage to be able to walk into a space and have a conversation about something that up until recent times, people simply did not, at least in some open forum like this, talk about. And that is racism, white supremacy, and things of that nature. So just being in that space, I felt was very edifying to the individuals that were there. And so Mavis, I'd like you to give a little bit from your perspective, and particularly as being a facilitator for the program.
Sure, sure. I love doing this. I love to know what people are thinking. There were a couple of poignant statements made. A couple of people felt hopeless. And they said, it's been going on so long, what can we do? What can we do? I pointed them towards some resources, but I brought that question back to Anita when we all gathered again. And I wanted her to answer that question because it's just spot on. Her future for her son, her grandson, Cairo, depends on us being hopeful. It depends on us being active. There was one older woman in the room too said, I can't believe it took this long for me to learn this stuff. She just hadn't had access to it. And then she said, I'm glad I learned it before I died. Which I thought was really powerful. It was that important to her. Not that she might not have as much time to do as she would like, but she really cared. She felt very deeply about the subject matter.
Thank you. Thank you. So I want to kind of piggyback off of what you said about the whole issue of Cairo and why Cairo has been such a central part of the work that I do from that anti-racism context. And I'm not going to go into the whole entire story behind it because a lot of people have probably already heard that story. But the primary issue for me is that little kids like Cairo, he's literally 3 years old. He'll be 4 years old in March of 2024. And little kids like that are dependent upon people like us to make the right types of choices.
Yeah.
And to put forth the right types of actions. Because it's pretty evident at this point, unless you live under a rock somewhere, it's pretty evident that these conversations about race and racism and so many other isms that are kind of connected to where we are right now are conversations that need to be had. We cannot continue to not have these conversations because Cairo's future and all those little boys out there, Black and brown and white, to be perfectly honest with you, their futures are going to be dependent upon what we do, how we do it, and whether or not we are doing it with conviction, and whether or not we are doing it coming from that place that there's always hope for something better. So my entire platform is really about this courage, conversation, relationship, and accountability to bring out the human potential to actually change stuff to make the world better for Cairo.
Exactly. I was just thinking about, wasn't it Sharon Hurley that said, I want you to look racism in the eye.
In the eye, absolutely.
Look racism in the eye. It's okay. We can do that. This is possible. I believe that with every bone in my body.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Gail, unfortunately, you weren't able to attend the program. with us, but just some of the conversations that the three of us have had after that, when we got together in our review session this morning. I'd like you to share a little bit about your take on what that experience was like and how you see that, particularly from that community conversation perspective, because that's something we're talking about doing in the city of Pittsburgh.
Exactly. And I can see us doing that, especially after your experience, because it was powerful. It was awakening, and it was enlightening, and people really sounded like they really were open to learning and to looking within that self-consciousness, that self-awareness, and looking at themselves critically. So that's huge. So I would love to continue that and to see where we can get that started here in Pittsburgh.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things that you've heard me say this so many times, when you go through this process of critical self-reflection, there's two things you really have to do. Number one, you have to be willing to decentralize yourself. And I say that because racism is not experienced by everybody. But if you are somebody who wants to know and understand what is that experience like for somebody like me, right? What does it feel like for me? And if you're not willing to engage in conversation to be able to hear that and turn yourself off, so to speak, so that you can hear my story, you can hear my voice, you can hear my experience, right? And so that's that critical self-reflection piece of it that comes into play. But it also means you have to be willing to listen, and you have to be willing to acknowledge that you really don't know what you don't know. I've said that 1,000 times.
Yeah.
You don't know what you don't know.
Right. And the listening is so crucial to any conversation, but especially when it comes to this issue around racism. And if we want to transform and be open to choosing differently and believing differently, we have to hear, we have to listen, we have to let our own ego go in order to, and put that aside in order to really hear the other person.
And
Absolutely.
avoid that stance of a rebuttal. Don't take the stance of a rebuttal.
Right.
Just listen.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that whole thing about the rebuttal is related to the idea of acknowledging you don't know what you don't know.
Right,
and
exactly.
In the subsequent conversations with the conversation we had with the church in Massachusetts, I would say that there was a lot of reckoning of that. Just this idea that white folks, for the most part, don't know this stuff.
That's right.
But then on the other hand, people like me, raised in a activist in the home with a mom who was an activist, Black history is something I've always been in tune to. And so there's a whole entire existence in the United States that people like me hold that in our memory, in our body, in our experiences that you don't have.
And we didn't know you held that in your body.
Absolutely.
We don't know what your experiences are. I just noticed that when Anita was summing up after the conversation and explaining why she has hope, I could feel people resting on her every word because it's different when it comes from a Black person. It's just different. We don't say it the same way. We don't hear it. We don't feel it the same way. I could say what Anita said, pretty close maybe after all this time, but they were really tuned into you, Anita, I think.
Yeah.
I think it was exciting to me. I think they would have loved an Anita in each breakout room, frankly. I think it would have been great. I know you'll be asked to do it again, but anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to say this last thing, and then I want to move on a little bit. But in the work that I do with the Center for Creative Leadership, there's a program that I facilitate, and it's called Better Conversations Every Day. And one of the key factors in that whole entire thing is related to listening for the purpose of understanding, intentionally listening for the purpose of understanding, not just to hear facts, but to hear feelings and to hear values. And so if you really want to be able to move into the space of really grasping and understanding the implications of racism, you have to be willing to go beyond the facts and step into the reality of people's feelings and what is it that they value.
That is so true. And for anybody who's listening and who knows me, it still took me so long to get out of my head and be faced, trying to reconcile the facts that I knew into my heart to really understand and feel how racism hurts all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it took me a while. These guys really hammered me. It was good, but I got there. Yeah, and I'm still working on that. I'll share a piece as we talk about our films.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize it enough, that idea of the conversation. So I'm really excited to think about the idea of taking what we did with the Massachusetts group and doing it here in Pittsburgh through churches here in Pittsburgh. I just think that would be such an incredible thing to do. And Gail, I think you would agree with
definitely.
me.
Yeah, and we can't have a conversation without being able to listen with the compassion, with the awareness of what the other person's really experiencing and feeling. Otherwise, it's just a monologue. It's not a dialogue. It's not a conversation.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And we definitely want to move beyond this just as a monologue.
That's right. That's
to
right.
be this
It has to be a conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're going to shift because Gail had mentioned a film.
Mm-hmm.
So in conjunction with what we did in terms of the community conversation and exploring the film Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America, Mavis, Gail, and I actually watched two other films, not in the community conversation context, but more just in the inflection point conversation context, right? So we watched these two films and then had some really extensive conversations. So I'm looking at the time. We may not get to both of them. So if we don't get to the second film, we'll have to continue this conversation in a later episode. But one of the films is a film called Hate. And it was directed by Javon DeWand. And the synopsis of the film is this: hate is the #1 disease in the world. Have you been tested? So just think about that question or that statement and that question. And when you think about some of the historical experiences that we've had that have been centered around racism, I think we can all agree that hate has been a part of that. When you look at the history of the KKK in this country, the history of lynchings in this country, the history of, just discrimination, desegregation, yes, and all of that, and
politics. There's plenty of hate.
Politics. It's all of it.
Everyone,
it's all of it. And until we get to a place of really recognizing the powerful force of hate, that's going to be, when I think about it, that's one of the enemies, if you will, that we need to overcome in order for Cairo to have the life that I would like to see for him to have. Because racism, white supremacy, hatred, violence, fear, those things are all interconnected. And so if we just kind of think about that question, have you been tested? Yeah. Have you been challenged? Right? So Gail, why don't you just maybe just
you've heard me say that
yes.
fear is the love is the opposite of fear, right? And hate really is fueled by fear and intense pain or distorted belief systems, right? That is often at the core of hate. And so if you look at that, the to test oneself, I love this one part. There's this little girl, black girl, that says, "I've been tested and I am love positive," and because that's what I
So
love it.
cute.
Just beautiful and innocent and just pure. But that's kind of basically what we all have to do. But it's, what does that mean? It means that we have to be willing to look within ourselves and look at what really it is that we're attaching to. Where's our fear? Where's our insecurities? Where is that fear and hurt coming from? That is creating this kind of anger and hate. And pick an area of the world right now, right? But certainly when it comes to racism, that we must look within ourselves and learn what that is that we're attaching to. And do we really know that what we're attaching to is absolutely true? No, it's not, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm going to read a little bit more about the film. We have about a couple of minutes before we go into break. And when we come back from the break, I really want to discuss our personal reaction or personal experience that we had in watching the film. So this is a little bit more of a description of the film, The Birth of Hate, a journey through America's most fraught eras illuminates the multi-layered effects of hatred via slavery, segregation, police brutality, and more. It conveys how the disease of hate has been impacted around the world, right? Or how the disease of hate has impacted so many around the world, to the point that Gail was just making. The hate journey, where the characters realize that the solution lies within education, respect, and the understanding of one another's experiences. So it kind of gets back to what we've been talking about almost since this podcast, the inception of this podcast, is this idea that we have to move beyond just seeing things through our jaded lens and be able to look at the world through a different perspective, a different lens. And to Gail's point, examining what lies within, because whatever lies within us, that's what's going to show up in the world in terms of our words, our actions, our behaviors. So your thoughts, your beliefs, and your ideas are what reside inside of you. But how does that flow into the world? Through your words, actions, and your behavior. So those are some things that we want to examine when we think about this film. So we're going to take a break. And then when we come back, we're going to get into a little bit more of what was depicted in the film, and how did we respond to that? What was our reaction in that? So we'll go to break and we'll come back and continue. So welcome back to Inflection Point Podcast and our discussion of films that spark community conversation. We are talking about the film called Hate, which was directed by Javon DeWand. And I want to read a little bit more about this one particular statement. The film is intended to be a journey through America's most fraught eras, illuminating the multi-layered effects of hatred via slavery, segregation, police brutality, and more. And so I'd like to dig a little bit now into the film itself and what was the impact that it had on you. So I'd like to start with you, Mavis, if I may.
Sure. Well, the film starts out with a white man who is just full of rage. And that scene might only last a minute. And I almost jumped out because it was just palpable, his rage. But then the message in the film is delivered in a very clever way. And he is engaged in conversations with an old Black man who keeps challenging him and is unafraid of him. And it's interesting how just the conversations with this black guy reveals the white guy's wounds and where his anger comes from. And he says things like his father was murdered, and the white guy's father, and it's not enough for him. He says, it was a black man who murdered my father. So that made it worse. And he had this thing in for all black men, which when you hear it in that context, it just makes no sense. So anyway, that's something that hit me. When I look at the sentence, have you been tested for hate? Even that was convicting for me. I tend to think of myself as more loving, but we all have to look in at those, like you were saying, Gail, those beliefs that we're tied to that cause us to have a hateful opinion. I'm trying to think of some of my other reactions. Can I pop up later? I'm sure I will about this film, but that's what comes to mind first off.
Yeah, so the contrast that you just kind of spoke of is this white guy, right? And this gentleman has the appearance of being a homeless person.
Right.
And I mean, his teeth are a mess, his hand, his hands look dirty, and there's just nothing about this guy that would be appealing to this white guy to want to have a conversation with him.
He ended up in his car. He wasn't invited.
Yeah, and definitely not in his car.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the guy just kind of showed up in his car. Like in the beginning scene, you see him walking down the street, and the next thing you know, he's actually sitting in the white man's car. And they begin to engage in a conversation. Now, mind you, the white guy has a gun. And so he's kind of wielding this gun around and threatening to, shoot him and all of that. But in all of that, the black man just remains in a certain demeanor. He doesn't, he's not frightened. He's not challenging. I take that back. He is challenging him to a great degree because he's challenging his ideas. He's challenging the beliefs that he has as this conversation is beginning to unravel, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that really jumped out at me with respect to the white guy is that there were these moments where you could see that his attention was gotten, right? Something that was said got his attention, not necessarily fully understanding or recognizing or anything like that, but it just made him stop and say, what are you talking about?
Right.
That sort of thing. So, Gail, which was your initial take on watching the film?
It's fascinating how it was written, and and just the two extremes of these two people, these two men, right? And the white guy was grieving. His dad they just buried his father, I guess, that day. And the black man, he was just so persistent in saying, I just want to have this conversation with you. I just want you to listen, right? And I mean, it was what we were talking about before, and challenge your beliefs, right? Because he was going off on all these distorted beliefs about Black people and race. They're all racist, right? And gradually, slowly, you could see how the black man was presenting himself to this guy. He was gradually starting to realize that, well, okay, so he really doesn't have a lot of basis to some of these beliefs, right? And that it's been passed on down from generation to generation. And so it was just really an impressive film and how they did this. And they interjected with conversations from different people too, which also
that's right. That's right. Why do you think they brought in the section about this man losing his little girl in the mall? I couldn't figure out how that was connected.
Because he said, if I can tell you something about yourself that I don't know, I would never know. Will you buy me this piece of pie? Will you go and get me this pie? But what he's really saying is will you listen to me? Right? when you start to believe that what I know what I'm talking about, I think is really what he was saying.
I thought too, maybe he was just trying to expose this white man's humanity that was under
Exactly,
all that
right.
pain, and
Well,
how
and
he
his
used his little
fear.
girl.
Right, because
Because
there's
of
a
his fear,
contrast.
right?
Yeah, there's a contrast there between the emotion that the man felt when it came to his daughter
Right.
and being lost momentarily or for a short period of time at the mall versus the little black boy with the basketball.
That's right. That's right.
Oh, right.
Remember the little black boy with the
Yes.
basketball who had gotten
Yes.
shot and killed?
But that's
And
right.
he's there and he shows up and he says, can I get some air in my ball? He needed a
Oh,
pump
that's
to
right.
put some more air in his ball. And the white guy responded to him in a very negative kind of way. And the little boy went to turn away. And when he turned away, you could see marks in his back from where he was shot in his back, right? And so for me, it was a contrast between that the emotion that the man had when it came to his daughter, but he couldn't match that emotion with the idea of a little
Right.
black kid that got killed.
Yeah, good point. And he says, see, that's what's wrong with all of you black people. See, and I thought, what? This little kid came up asking for help. Yeah, and then he just made these sweeping statements.
Right. He
White
was,
guy.
it was almost impossible for him to go there. Right.
Yeah,
But with his daughter, he could go there immediately.
right. Who gets to talk about the hoodie? You
Yeah.
want to, Rita?
I was just thinking
good.
about
That was amazing.
thinking about the hoodie. But before we get to the hoodie, because there's multiple connections about the hoodie, right?
Right.
Because if you recall in the scene where the black man turns around and there's somebody in the back seat.
Right. Who has a hoodie on.
And there's somebody in the back seat that has a hoodie on. It's a black teen that has a hoodie on and he's got a pack of Skittles. So right away, you know that that's a reference to the murder of Trayvon Martin.
Exactly.
Right. And so just think about how these different things were woven into this story that was being told, but it wasn't being told in like the traditional kind of way. So then you kind of see, okay, that teenage boy is representing Trayvon Martin because the black man in the front, his name was what was his name? Booth.
Booth. Yeah.
Booth.
Booth.
Yes.
B-O-T-H-E.
Turns of yeah, right. Booth. No, it's B-O-T-H-E.
Right. That's what I said. B-O-T-H-E.
Oh, okay. Yeah. B-O-T-H-E. But he turns around like in the middle of the conversation and says, "Can I have some Skittles?" And then your attention is now diverted to the person that's in the back seat, and it's somebody that's representing Trayvon Martin. Right? So that's
deceased, right? Right.
Pardon?
The young boy in the back seat was deceased. It was, and so he was having to look at that, like the little boy outside the window or the little girl.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And really wrapping your mind around, particularly with Trayvon, what happened. Like he was literally just walking home and never made it home. Like how do you reconcile that? Right? And again, it's this contrast with how you're feeling when your daughter, you didn't lose your daughter. She wasn't like killed, but yet there's a different way that you're responding to this child versus that child who, both ended up in not the best situations. And the hoodie is also significant because the white guy was wearing a hoodie.
Black hoodie.
A black hoodie. No, it was gray. It was like a dark gray color. It was a dark gray color. And he had the hood on his head.
Yeah.
Not throughout the entire film, but there were
at the end,
different places where he had the hood on his head. And then you got Trayvon Martin, this depiction of Trayvon Martin in the back with a hood on his head. Right? And so it was just these contrasts that were being presented in the film, I thought, in a very kind of way.
It was.
And symbols, like, is a hoodie really dangerous?
Right.
Exactly. And all the time, mind you, the guy is wielding a gun.
Yes.
Threatening to blow the
blow his head off.
Booth heads off and all of that. His whole conversation is centered around, I have this gun and you should be afraid of me because I have this gun.
Mhm.
Right?
That's
And
what he
then
wanted.
I'm sorry?
That's what he wanted. He wanted to intimidate and frighten. Yeah.
Exactly. And then there's an aspect about his father's death. Right? And the father was, I believe he was a police officer, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a police officer. He's coming home. Somebody accosts him as he's at the door getting ready to open up the, with the key to go in the house, and somebody sneaks up behind him with a gun and shoots and kills him. Right? And it happened to be a Black man. It was a Black man that shot and killed his father. And so there's this scene when he's describing, that situation and everything. And Booth makes the statement that, yeah, a man shot your father. And hoodie guy said, no, it wasn't a man. It was a Black man that shot my father. Right. And so what that said right there, the same way you can hold your daughter over here in the space over here.
Yeah, good
and
point.
You're putting this little Black kid over here in that space, you're doing the same thing.
Same thing, that's right.
Because somehow it would have been maybe better, right? If the person who had killed his dad was a white guy, because he would have responded in a different kind of way.
Yeah, he would have.
He would have responded in a different kind of way, which was the point of them showing these different contrasts.
Because his intention was to kill the Black man that killed his father.
Exactly.
That's why he had the gun.
That's why he had the gun.
Yeah.
Exactly. And every Black person that he encountered, because remember the guy in the beginning, he just kept throwing
was watching
and everything came from a place of pure hatred.
That's right.
And the way he was walking through the streets and engaging with people and everything, it definitely came from a place of hatred. Yeah. So now it's let's think about when it was all said and done. Booth is now gone. White guy sitting in his car with his hoodie on, head kind of down, and what happens?
Right. Wow.
What happens, Mavis?
Okay. It's just such a cool scene. A policeman comes up, points a gun at his head.
A white police officer.
Yeah, a white police officer.
And called him Blackie, right?
Called him
Blackie. Yeah. And to take off your hoodie, take off your hoodie. And then the white man, of course, reveals his white face. And then the policeman says, just after he puts his gun back in the holster, what are you doing here? This is a dangerous place. It's like you're a white person. You don't need to be in a dangerous place.
But his first reaction was to put that gun away. I mean, before he said anything, right?
And this guy could have been a big time criminal. He was fixing to be anyway.
Yes,
waving that gun around.
Yeah, the thing that really that out of the whole entire film, that was the part that resonated with me the most. Because when the officer initially walks up to the car, operating under the assumption that it's a Black man or a Black teen sitting in the car, that was his automatic assumption, right?
Yeah.
His second automatic assumption is that I need to have my gun out. So he immediately took his gun out, aims the gun at the person in the car, and proceeds to tell him, calls him the word Blackie, and proceeds to tell him to take his hood off. Take your hood off. Gun pointed right directly at him, right? And so what does the guy do? He slowly takes off his hood.
Reveals himself, yeah.
And when he does that, it's revealed that it's a white guy. First thing he did was put the gun back in his holster.
Yeah, amazing.
First thing he did was put the gun back, even though the guy had a gun in the car. Didn't ask him.
So ironic. Didn't even ask
anything.
him.
Well, he also had
Nothing.
empty cans of alcohol on the back floor of the back seat.
Right.
Cans of
exactly.
alcohol. Cans of alcohol in the chair saying, oh, looks like you might not be feeling too good or something like that. When the guy should probably have been picked up for drunk driving, if nothing else.
Exactly. Exactly. And
Yeah.
so for me, that was the main thing in that film was
Right.
that contrast
Mhm.
I
that
know.
was shown in that officer's behavior
Immediate, yes, yeah.
when he realized that it was a white man that was in that car.
Do you think the white guy had even a few seconds to think, so that's what it's like to be Black?
One would hope.
I hope so.
One would
One
hope.
would hope.
Or did he think, thank God I'm white? You know, I mean, there's just
Right.
no way to really understand the level of fear that, you know, particularly Black males must encounter
Oh,
regularly. Yeah. You know,
Right.
there was something I remembered from the film now that hit me. It was one of the, there were a couple of people who brought up the idea of Black on Black crime. Like, we want
right.
the narrative is, you know, Black people commit more crimes, and then the narrative after that is, well, they do more Black on Black crimes. And it's just such an interesting way of explaining away
Right.
why there is why there is violence, period. Like white people are angels.
Right,
You
there's
know?
white on white crime too, right?
Of course there is, but you know, it's like the words fence Black people off as having a unique problem.
Exactly. And it isn't.
Yeah. And right, even statistically, it's not so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not at all. Not at
no.
all. And but that's a part of that blinders on,
Mhm.
that's sort of looking through the world like this.
Right. I'm not going to challenge that belief, right? I'm going to
And
take
it's
it as it's
rooted,
true.
and we all
Mm.
know it's rooted in white supremacy.
Right.
Mhm.
It's rooted in white supremacy.
Yes.
It's a
Right.
way of making Black folks less. They're less than us because they do that to each other. Look how they
But
behave.
we've been, even before
Long before that.
we got to this point,
Right.
we were considered to be less than, because think about it. How can you perpetrate the whole entire slave
Of course.
trade if you consider these people to be your equal?
Right.
One of the ways of keeping that attitude alive, though, too, don't you think?
But that's just, so the way I see it is, if you're constantly being told, and I'm talking about, we're going back to what, 16, 19?
Mhm.
And the conversation being, well, we can enslave them because, number one, it says in the Bible, supposedly in the Bible, that the descendants of Ham were doomed to be, or cursed by God to be enslaved, right? So that's lie number one. And then this whole idea of, how am I going to justify the brutality and the violence that is associated with slavery if I
Right.
consider these people to be my equal?
Yeah.
And then
right.
you mix that in with, you know, the whole notion of building up this economy and all of that. I mean, if you look at this purely through a white supremacist lens, it makes perfect sense that they would do and say what they say about us.
Mhm.
Because that's the only way that you could keep this thing in check, is to
Right,
continue
right.
to lie after lie after lie after lie after lie to maintain that storyline.
Right.
You know,
We have about 5 more minutes before we are done.
this is quick. We've talked about how you and I as a white person will see things differently.
Mhm.
I did not see the bullet holes in the back of that child.
Didn't
That
you?
came up to
You
get his
didn't?
mom. No.
Go back
Really?
and watch it. Because
Oh,
remember
yeah.
the
I
little girl
watched
had
it
the
twice.
Band-Aid that
remember
was
the
his
little
daughter.
girl
Like,
had the Band-Aid on her head.
Yes.
You
yes,
remember, because she was saying, "Oh, kiss my boo-boo," or whatever.
Yes. Yes.
When that little boy came with the basketball,
yeah.
and he turned, the white guy said something to him, and he was like, "Oh no, I'm not looking for trouble." And he turned around, he had bullet holes.
You didn't see that.
Not. Did
Yeah, you
not.
got to go back and watch that, because that is so key. That's
It's
probably the reason why you didn't pick up
Right.
on the difference between why he was acting that way with his daughter versus the little black boy.
Exactly, yeah.
maybe.
Because you got to pick
Yeah.
up on the fact that there's
That's right, he
bullets.
hasn't realized that there's a child that was killed.
Isn't it amazing how the mind picks out things to see
Yeah.
based on my experience, based on all of our experiences?
Mhm.
I watched it twice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
I
that's
want to make a comment about what you were saying, Anita, because when in convincing themselves that Black people were less than, they took these people from another country that didn't speak the language. They wouldn't let them learn the language. They wouldn't let them learn how to read and write. So they just allowed themselves to believe, right? And to continue to believe that they were less than. And
Right,
all
exactly.
based
Because
on
it was
lies.
all a part of being able to build
That's right.
this system that we have.
Right. Right.
Somebody has to be underneath so that we can build
Right.
everything on top of
Right.
all of that. Right?
free labor. Yeah.
Free labor.
Yeah, exactly.
And who built this
That's
country,
like,
right?
yeah, that's
Yeah.
like the curse of America is this idea of free labor.
Right.
Even
it's
cheap labor.
Of course, you're going to make money on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we
Oh,
literally have
this was fun.
3 more minutes. So I wanted to
Okay.
kind of close out because I've, gotten in this habit of closing out with a particular quote. And this quote is actually from Sarah Jakes Roberts. She's like one of my favorite women of God. Like she just blows me away. I listen to her like multiple times in a week, sometimes multiple days in a row and things like that, because her message is always so powerful in that it builds you up from the inside out, right? So this is the quote. Remember this, you are strong enough to confront your history. Don't turn away from your brokenness. Remember that you're not doing this alone. God foreknew this moment would come. And every now and then we need a reminder that someone else has defeated a giant that we must face. And this is actually a quote that comes from a book. I haven't read the book, but the book is entitled, Don't Settle for Safe, Embracing the Uncomfortable to Become Unstoppable. And so when I think about that hope thing, that hope question that we were talking about earlier, that statement right there says it all for me. We have to be willing to embrace being uncomfortable in order to become unstoppable as we are moving in a different direction.
Right.
That will be of benefit to future generations. Those emergent leaders that we've been talking about with this Sankofa leadership continuum, those emergent leaders like my grandson Zane, Cairo, those young people that are going to be up and coming in those spaces, we need to be unstoppable when it comes to dealing with and dismantling racism and activating anti-racism. So the question is, what are you going to do? Will Cairo have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? And as always, the final question is, what will you do to ensure children have the right to freely and peacefully exist in whatever skin they are born in? So to our audience, I want to thank you for joining us. And we'll see you the next time at Inflection Point Podcast, right here on Transformation Talk Radio. We are here every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern time, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.